my dear friends, greetings and welcome. For those of you who have never met me, I'm Irvin Shrewsbury Cobb, born and bred in this fair city. Yes, I'd left to become a journalist and a writer of some consequence, but I never left in spirit. In fact, my final resting place is with a family of friends I made over at the Oak Grove Cemetery. It's right down that street. This may sound a little odd, but there's some lively characters out there. You ought to come to visit. Well, back to the business at hand. Thanks to the efforts of Mr. Robert Dafford and team, we have more murals to enjoy. And with each new mural comes new characters to meet. We'll introduce them for you this evening. So you all just settle back. It's going to be a very special evening. Now, the first guest I thought should be someone familiar to you all. Now, who amongst you has never heard of General George Rogers Clark? It's altogether fitting that we honor General Clark because he's a true American Revolutionary War hero.
I suppose you could say I was born to wander. Even though I had an opportunity to attend a private school, I preferred the great outdoors. I mean, after all, when there were horses to race, foxes to hunt, and shooting matches to win, who had time to master the elements of French, Latin, and Greek, like my Scottish schoolmaster longed that I would acquire? The wilderness intrigued me. I love the great outdoors. I love the plants, the animals. I love the earth itself. As a matter of fact, later in my life, I had obtained a pretty extensive collection of petrified fossils and extinct animals. And the President of the United States, my good friend Thomas Jefferson, asked me to contribute my mammoth to his museum. But wait a second, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's go back to my youth and how I came to know and love this land we call Kentucky. Kentucky, that's an Indian word, Kentucky, which means our home of tomorrow. Anyway, at the age of 19, I began surveying under the direction of my grandfather, Rogers, and this proved to be an opening in my career. My friends and I would often talk about the West. My imagination was captured with the possibilities as to what was beyond the next horizon. So in 1772, I set out with some other adventurers to go exploring. We crept by Indian villages and were so afraid of being caught, captured, or killed that we would sometimes sleep down by the river on the rocks, close to our boats. It was fierce and scary, all right, but this new world, it was filled with an exquisite beauty. Like the rich, fertile soil, the majestic walnut trees, the oak, the hickory, the ash, the elm, and the animals, like the mighty buffalo, the graceful deer, the wild turkey, the abundance. It was truly a Garden of Eden. So I ended up in Ohio for a while, where I hunted, split rails, girded trees, and burned the brushwood in order to prepare the land for cultivation. And then when the first settlers began to arrive, I gave considerable attention into surveying their farms. Then in 1773, I joined a company with the purpose of surveying in central Kentucky. And then a year later in June, I went back with 90 men to form a settlement in Kentucky. It wasn't easy going. The Shawnee were thick in those parts, and they were a dangerous enemy. There were reports of many murders, including Daniel Boone's son. But despite what you may have heard today, many of the white men and the Indians tried to forge a chain of friendship, which many of us did, that's lasted for years. After surveying in Kentucky, I decided to make Kentucky my home. I believe then and I believe now there's not a more richer or beautiful territory in the entire world, and I decided to be a part of this region's future. When the American Revolution began, I found myself to be the rank of general and leading men through rough conditions once again. In 1776, I led an expedition of flatboats down the Ohio River. We hit the falls at Louisville and pushed on all the way down to Fort Massac, where later we abandoned our boats about 12 miles down from the mouth of the Tennessee, where we marched through forests, swamps, fought many battles, captured many territories, including the fort in Vincennes, Indiana. Later in my life, 1795 to be exact, the United States federal government awarded me 2 tracts of land in southwestern Kentucky. It was approximately 74,000 acres and contained a large portion of McCracken County, including the present site of Paducah. Of course, back then it wasn't called Paducah, it was called Pekin. And it was just a small clearing down here at the foot of this street you call Broadway. My, how things have changed. Oh, I understand you named a school after me, George Rogers Clark Elementary. I consider this to be a great honor and want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I once heard there was a famous Kentuckian by the name of Henry Clay who made the statement that he had never met a Kentuckian who wasn't going home. Well, today I feel like I have come home. I feel like we have come home to Paducah.
Yes, George, this town has become truly amazing. Exploring didn't give you much chance to think about the future. It did, however, prod you to theorize about things that you'd found. My brother George developed a theory, for instance, that in its day was questioned, but is now generally accepted, I believe. See, folks, in those days there were mounds in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys that were somewhat of a mystery. Noah Webster and Ezra Stiles, then president of Yale College, thought that the mounds were built by followers of Madoc, a 12th century Welsh prince. Webster even thought the mounds may have been built by Ferdinand de Soto, a view also advanced by Benjamin Franklin. Even old Noah Webster eventually agreed with George. I guess no matter which century it is, it's always nice to be able to say, "I told you so." After my brother passed away in February of 1818, this very land we're standing on was passed on to me, William Clark. The whole deed transfer was accomplished for a whole $5. Probably not much in today's standard, I'd wager. Later in 1827, I came and laid out the streets and gave your town the name it bears today. Later on, I went with Captain Meriwether Lewis, and we formed the Lewis and Clark Expedition, Corps of Discovery, where we went up the Missouri River in hopes of finding a northwest passage to the great Pacific Ocean. My brother was a special person, and Paducah's a special place, isn't it?
Moving along, friends, it's now 1836. Now that's 9 years after General William Clark laid out the streets of the town. The original settlers built a log structure that was 60 feet wide and 33 feet high for a cost of about $450. Now that was the original market house and was over on South 2nd Street. It had to be expanded in 1850. Now the market house was surrounded by saloons and other businesses of sort of a strange and mysterious nature. So the locals gave that location the name of Pistol Street. One can only imagine what sort of mischief went on there. The current market house was erected in 1905 at a cost of $23,000, and it was designed by a local architect, W.L. Brainerd, and built by a local contractor, George Cattejohn, and it's a beauty. But let me step aside and let you hear about this place, which was actually the center of town for quite some time, from someone else. Please meet Miss Lila Davis.
I began working in the kitchen of a well-to-do family in Paducah when I was 10 or 11 years old. The cook there, I called her Cook, same as everyone else, was a pleasant woman, which is a good thing because she was also a very large woman. When Cook called you to get out of bed early in the morning, you best listen. Everything I needed to know about food I learned from her, how to cook it, how to cut it, how to can it, how to cater it. But the most important lesson I learned from Cook, I learned at Market House. Before you can put out the best meal, Missy, she told me once, you got to find the best ingredients. The market was open from 4 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, so Cook had me up and going by 3:30 in the morning. Now I tell you, that early morning work wasn't my favorite part of the job, but summers I got to catch me a little bit more shut-eye because the market didn't open till 5. But nobody complained because it was work we were all well paid for, and there was lots of poor folk would have traded places with us in a minute. Now the farmers would bring their crops and sell them from their wagons. If things were going especially good for them, they might rent a stall for the day. One of my favorite farmers to see was Mr. Perdue. He and his sons would bring their vegetables to the market, and he was always walking through the market trying to steer the grocers to his wagon. I loved listening to him, and he had lots of stories for free along with the vegetables he was selling. Mr. Perdue and his sons couldn't afford a stall, so they had to settle for parking their wagon along the curb at 2nd and Kentucky Avenue. Now this was an area known as Poor Man's Row, but I didn't think of him as poor. I loved listening to his stories about growing up in Paducah. Why, did you know he even saw Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West show when they came through town? Sure enough. Two of Mr. Perdue's sons, Herman and Ernest, well, they were at the market with him, selling the possums and rabbits that they had trapped the week before. Herman told me that they would send those skins to Sears and Roebuck once a year and get some money for them. I heard later on that Herman went on and graduated from Murray State Teachers College, became a Navy officer in World War II. Ain't that something? All of Mr. Perdue's kids done good for themselves, while Roy, he learned to bake and decorated cakes for the president and the White House. His girl Lydia, she got married and moved to Chicago. And Ernest, well, Ernest stayed on right here. I sure am glad all of his kids done so good, because he worked so hard for all of them. Let's see, what else did we get at market? The hunters would bring their wild geese and deer and rabbits and sell them, and the butchers were always waving their shiny silver knives at you and cutting the meat exactly like you like. Woo, that meat, and I'll tell you now, that's my least favorite part of the market. All those flies hanging around. But the vegetable and fruit stalls, now that was my favorite part. Sweet potatoes, new potatoes, corn. I could just look at an ear of corn and imagine the sweet buttery taste or the sharp wetness of a green pepper. Lettuce, carrots, okra, peas, new potatoes, sweet potatoes, butter beans, lima beans, green beans. You name the vegetable, and to this day I can tell you how much I like it. And then there was the fruit. Lord have mercy, the fruit. Watermelons, cantaloupes, apples, strawberries and peaches. I was always torn between a strawberry and a peach as my favorite, but in the end I reckon a ripe red strawberry would have to win out. What do you think, Sally Mae? I don't know. Peach cobbler by Cook sure was mighty fine. Oh, but I'm way off track. I'm trying to tell you about the market house. It was indeed the hub of the city, just like Mr. Cobb said. In 1903, John Philip Sousa and his band performed on the front portion of the 2nd floor of that building. Did you know that? Sure enough. Lots of business dealings went on there, and it was a legal site for the sale of property. And of course, everyone did their shopping there. River travelers, whenever they stepped off the boat, saw Market House first thing. No, I never regretted going to market. Never minded at all. And I sure am glad to see it looking so nice. Why, I hear you even see plays there now and have an art museum. Ain't that something? Will wonders never cease?
No, my dear Miss Lila, wonders will never cease as long as there's a Paducah. Did you realize that Mr. Perdue you mentioned has living relatives in the area? Yes, yes. Mr. Kermit Perdue is the chief of the Paducah City Police, and he's the grandson of Joseph Albert Perdue, the farmer that was selling his goods over at the market house. Yes. Well, our next guest possibly needs no introduction to most Paducans. One of the finest names this area has ever produced. We have honored him by naming our airport after him, by erecting a statue to him on Jefferson Street, and by naming a beautiful city street after him. In our hearts, he's always the Veep. Ladies and gentlemen, the former Vice President of the United States of America, Alben W. Barkley.
I dare say I am fit to be tied. Why, here it is. The 4th of July, there's a crowd of good folks, and as if all that weren't enough, it would appear I have the floor, so to speak. Now, you got to understand that to a politician, this is sweeter than a bowl of coffee ice cream. Since most of you know me, or have at least heard of me, I figured I'd take this time to tell you some of what my journalist friends might call the inside scoop. Those details about my life, which for one reason or another failed to capture the newspaper's fancy, but which nonetheless were mighty important to me. For though it is true I rose to occupy the office of the Vice Presidency of these great United States of America, I have always been, at heart, a good old farm boy from Kentucky. I was born on my granddaddy's farm in Graves County between Lowe's and Fancy Farm on the 24th day of November in the year of our Lord 1877 at 3:30 o'clock in the morning. Now, don't ask me how I happen to remember the time. I reckon I heard my mama talk about it a time or two. I entered that small log house like most everyone before me, crying and hollering and wanting attention. And like for most everyone before me, well, it seemed to work. I had my share of attention. Oh, here's one little family tidbit of which you might not be aware. In spite of how you may have seen my name written or heard me introduced, I was not born Alban W. Barkley. No, sir. My birth name was not Alban William. The name my parents bestowed upon me at birth was Willie Alban. Willie Alban, not even William, mind you, just Willie Alban. They had intended all along to call me Alban after my grandfather, and did so. But the Willie was, well, at least from my point of view, a wholly misbegotten gesture of recognition toward two uncles. And they weren't even rich uncles. So as soon as I was old enough to assert myself, I firmly let it be known that my official name henceforth was Alban William Barkley, and no foolishness. Willie Alban. Like, can you imagine even surviving a Kentucky childhood named Willie Alban? And then later trying to get into politics? I doubt anybody called Willie Alban could have been elected assistant superintendent of the county poorhouse. As a child, I worked on neighboring farms, and then later on went off and got my law degree, then returned here to Paducah to live. Now, it might not seem such to you, but let me assure you, to a young man from the country, this town was a lively, even exciting place in which to live. As young blades itching for a little entertainment, we used to go over to Fisher Gardens, later called LaBelle Park, and then I believe Wallace Park. Oh, it was a lovely place. We danced the waltz and the two-step with the prettiest young ladies. Of course, there were always visits to town by the traveling circuses, the river steamboats with our wonderful ear-splitting calliopes, the original Buffalo Bill show that Lila mentioned Mr. Perdue had seen. There were hot air balloon ascensions, and oh, how could I almost forget that most memorable day in 1910 when a barnstorming aviator came to Paducah in the first heavier-than-air flying machine ever seen in these parts. It was on that occasion that Colonel Ben Weil, a prominent merchant and citizen, became the first Paducan ever to fly in an airplane. Yes, those were good days here for a fledgling lawyer, which is what I had been educated to be. I hung my shingle here after passing the bar. I understand there's a fine bronze plaque down here on Broadway which reads, "Here, U.S. Senator Alban W. Barkley had his law office, 1904. Well, just between you, me, and the fence post, I would be less than honest were I not to admit that in those days, folks were hardly knocking down my doors to engage my services. In fact, in order to make a living, I was forced to continue my duties as court reporter for a number of years. Now, between that and the law practice, I was able to earn enough money to pay off the debts I had acquired during those lean years since leaving Marvin College. And by frugal living, I was even able to save a little and take additional specialized coursework at the University of Virginia Law School. Now, upon returning to Paducah from Virginia, I found myself joining a number of civic clubs, and at one such function, I had my first taste of a political race of sorts. At an election of the Elks Club, a friend of mine who had not informed me of his intentions nominated me for the office of exalted ruler of the lodge. Oh, he made a fine speech in my favor, and I swelled up with pride. But as he took his seat, another gentleman stood up. Now, I got nothing against Barkley personally, he said, but the fact of the matter is he's a lawyer, and lawyers are getting everything in this town. Why, just look at them. They hold almost all the elected offices in city and county government. Now here they are trying to take over our fraternal organizations. I'm against Barkley because he's a lawyer. Well, I sat there uncomfortably as my sponsor again rose to his feet. I've listened to my friend, he began, and there may be some truth in what he says. For lawyers are indeed becoming right prominent in our affairs. But in the case of Brother Barkley, don't let it worry you. He ain't much of a lawyer. That was, incidentally, an election I did not win. In 1903, I married Miss Dorothy Brower, lovely girl who grew up here in Paducah. We had a happy partnership which lasted until her death in 1947. During the last few years of her life, she was afflicted with a heart ailment which left her an invalid. It was during this period that I began accepting speaking engagements from all parts of the country in an effort to raise the money necessary to provide her with the treatments and specialized nursing care she required. You see, I had not continued my law practice upon entering public service and had little income apart from my salary as a senator. But back during the early years of our marriage, we discovered that we shared a common interest in collecting antiques. Not just early American pieces, but old furniture, china, pictures, whatnot, from all over the world. In 1937, the year of the tragic flood, my wife and I acquired Angles, my final home in Paducah, which we filled with our antiques and, more important, 3 wonderful, lively children. Angles was, or rather I should say is, a fine old Civil War era residence which I had long admired and dreamed of owning since I was a young man. Colonel Quintus Quincy Quigley, one of Paducah's pioneer lawyers, had built it back in the 1860s. Well, I'm told that today it is the home of another lawyer, Ann Gwynn, and her husband, Dr. Jim Gwynn. I hail the Gwynns for their efforts in restoring the old home place. It is much appreciated. I suppose it was inevitable that I should go into politics. I was, after all, a Kentuckian and a lawyer, and I had in those days a natural inclination to stop whatever I was doing and start making a speech anytime I saw as many as 6 persons assembled together. In fact, back in the early years in Paducah, I once gave a speech to a local sportsmen's organization on the assigned topic, mind you, of crackling bread and sweet milk. Now, don't you just wonder what I had to say on that topic. Or more to the point, why on earth anyone would ask me to say it. But since I have gotten around to the topic of food, I was wondering if I could persuade someone to rustle me up a bowl of coffee ice cream as soon as this shindig settles down. Oh, I love ice cream. My second wife, Jane, used to tease me about my appetites. Every evening, along about 9:30, I would invariably turn to her and say, "Janie, wouldn't a little ice cream taste good about now?" She used to try to, during the early years of our marriage, impress me with her fancy cooking, until one day I finally just had to take a chance on breaking that poor woman's heart. "Jane, my love," I said, "I'm a plain eater. I'm just a country boy. Old-fashioned country-style cooking is the only kind I can appreciate." Now, true to her nature, she battened down her hatches and learned a few of Lulu's recipes. Lulu cooked for us at the time. My all-time favorite meal: country ham, at least 2 years old, smoked over hickory wood shavings, cabbage boiled up with a piece of hog jowl, or turnip greens cooked up with more jowl, and on top of the greens, a nest of poached eggs. Homemade cornbread, plenty of butter. And if I wasn't on my diet, I loved a white potato or two, cooked up with string beans and, oh yes, more hog jowl. I was not interested in any kind of salad. And under no circumstances did I even want to sit at the same table with a carrot. You top all that off with a generous portion of chess pie and woo-wee, I was one happy rascal. Well, looky here, the time has gotten away from me and I've gone on longer than I intended. But you know how we politicians can be, and after all, you did ask for it. I suppose I'll close by sharing with you my final memories of Paducah. Jane and I were returning from Washington, where we had just handed over the task of running our great nation to Dwight David Eisenhower and Richard Milhous Nixon. We pulled into the driveway over at Angles and just sat there for a minute or two, looking up at the old house. Finally, Janie said, "It's good to be home, isn't it?" "Yes, it is," I said. "They don't build them like this anymore. Sounder than a dollar. We better get in on side. Mabel will be worried about us." That evening, I was feeling a little blue. I went on into a back bedroom where I kept this old radio. I stretched out across that bed and, oh, by and by, I drifted off to sleep. In my dreams, I was a younger man, listening to my favorite show on the radio. The Lone Ranger and Tonto were riding their horses, chasing the bad guys. And when I awoke, it took me a couple of minutes to realize just how old I really was. Well, I believe I'll have some of that coffee ice cream now.
We have one final guest to hear from today. Now, many of you are probably aware that there was a battle here in Paducah during the Civil War. But I'll wager that not many of you have had a chance to hear from it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. This is Jack Booker, and I'll let him tell you his story.
I don't suppose there was ever any time in my life when I felt more thrilled and scared at the same time as when I served in the Civil War under Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. And out of that whole terrible time, there was one day I recall above all the others. March 25th, 1864. It was gray here then, as it's wont to be in this town in March, and the air was cold and heavy. It was Good Friday, but didn't feel like it. Didn't feel like spring was ever coming again. I'm talking about the 1,800 cavalrymen under General Forrest, rode into Paducah over the old Mayfield Road. We reached Eden's Hill around 2 that afternoon. Our troops cut crosswise and halted near 15th and Broadway to wait for further orders. It felt strange to me, being a Paducah boy, to be invading my own town. Because I was from here, I was one of 6 Paducahans chosen to carry a message from General Forrest to Colonel Stephen Hicks, who was in command of the Federals. My buddies and I rode over to Fort Anderson with a note that said, "Having a force aptly sufficient to carry your works and reduce the place, and in order to avoid the unnecessary effusion of blood, I demand the surrender of the fort and troops with all public property. If you surrender, you shall be treated as prisoners of war, but if I have to storm your works, you may expect no quarter." And it's signed, N.B. Forrest, Major General, commanding Confederate troops. I figured Colonel Hicks would surely surrender, taking into mind that they only had 665 men defending the fort. But here's what Colonel Hicks's reply was. "Sir, I have this moment received yours of this instant, in which you demand the unconditional surrender of forces under my command. I can answer that I have been placed here in the government to defend this post, and in this, as well as all other orders from my superiors, I feel it to be my duty as an honorable officer to obey. I must therefore respectfully decline surrendering as you may require." And this is signed, S.G. Hicks, Colonel, commanding post. It was 4:30 by the time all this note writing and reading was finished, and Colonel Forrest finally issued his command. "Forward, men, and mix with them," he hollered. Colonel Albert Thompson of Paducah led the cavalrymen towards the fort. Now let me explain the place to you so you can get it into your mind's eye what the action looked like. The structure itself was 400 feet long and ran 160 feet towards the river. 50-foot ditches filled with water surrounded the west, north, and south sides. When the cavalrymen reached these ditches, we had to dismount and make a run for it. Fire was raining down on us. Grape shot and canister. A barrage was flying through the cold, gray air from gunships. We drew back and regrouped and tried to charge again, but they held. The third time, half the Confederates surged forwards again. This time, many of us went into houses nearby the fort and fired down into the fort from second-story windows. The attack kept getting worse until General Forrest rode up and ordered a succession. He could see it was going to be mighty difficult to capture the breastworks without heavy artillery. We were tired and discouraged and bloodied and dirty. My heart felt so heavy and hard, it felt like a cannonball. There might be some that killing comes easy to, but I don't believe there's many. Well, anyway, we lingered around the fort until around 8 that evening. Then we slowly siphoned off. By midnight, we had all left, taking the same route back to Mayfield. Official word came back later. 14 were killed and 46 wounded on the Federal side. On the Confederate side, 11 were killed and 39 wounded, including Colonel Albert Thompson, who was hit in the chest by a cannonball while he was on his charger at 516 Park Avenue. You might have heard of Colonel Thompson. He was a tall man with real dark hair. He was Commonwealth attorney here, and when he died, he was 35. It was sad business all the way around. I think it was extra hard for me and my buddies from Paducah. We knew these folks. We could see how the war was sucking the life and beauty out like a tick sucks out blood. It was, folks suffered losses on all sides. We heard later Colonel Hicks, fearing another invasion, ordered all houses within firing range to be destroyed. 60 homes were leveled, and none of those folks ever recovered a single dime from the government. There were plenty of losses on both sides. People leaving their businesses and homes and crossing to the Illinois side. Later, my pa told me about old George Oslager, who ran a bakery at 825 South 3rd. He had just received a large payment from the Federals for supplies and was counting the money when the warning of the invasion came. He threw a newspaper over the money, a whopping $2,862, and ran for his life to the river. Somehow, rumor got back to him that his place had burned, as many had. Folks on the Illinois shore could see the smoke and fire of battle visible 4 miles away from Brookport. He made his way back and found his place had just been ransacked. And you know, the plunderers never thought to look under that newspaper. Makes you kind of smile, doesn't it? All that silver protected by a tossed piece of newspaper. But that was all there was to smile about. General Forrest did issue us a bit of leave time, and I came back to Paducah. I got a new mount, some fresh clothes, and Ma gave me dumplings and beans and chicken and her biscuits. I knew that food was probably all they'd have for a week, because times were tough. After my belly was full, I slept in my bed again like I was 12. My pa even hugged me, something he hadn't done since I was a man. It was sure hard leaving and going back to my unit, and I hate to admit this, but I had to hold back my own tears when my ma commenced to crying. Later on, long after the war was over and I'd returned to Paducah, I used to come down to the river and sit and stare and remember. And that's when I did let those tears come. The river was calling them out of me. It's like that old Ohio knew tears could heal me as much as anybody could heal from things like that.